Hi, I'm Coles Roberts, and I'm going to talk about apples. We have an old fruit tree catalog. It's a single sheet from a nursery that used to be near Morristown. There's no date on it, but I know it's pretty old because Morristown was two words then, Moorestown. And the catalog describes the nursery as being 8 miles from Cooper's Ferry, which we now call Camden, on the stage road to Mount Holly. And there's quite a list of apple varieties on this old sheet, 52 of them, but I've only heard of a few. And I'd be surprised if more than half a dozen are even being grown today, because all of the apples came over from England and from Europe. In fact, the only apples native to North America were crab apples. But many of the apples didn't do well here. The climate was different, for various reasons, so when the country was young, they didn't have many good apples. Then back before the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, a new variety was found. And my son and I visited the site of that in about 1970. And I'll give you the story, the way the man who farmed that land then gave it to us. A man named Jesse Hyatt was farming the land. He was keeping some apples in his cave. They call them caves. They're man-made affairs, mostly underground. Many of the farms in the Midwest have them. We would call them tornado shelters, which they are. But they're as cool as any cellar, and before they had refrigerators, they kept food in them. Well, some of these apples spoiled and he threw them out. Some of the seeds sprouted and trees grew. Some of the trees bore fruit. It's very unusual for a tree that's grown from a seed this way to grow apples that are any good. But one of the trees had good apples. They were different from any Jesse Hyatt had ever seen before. It was a pretty red apple. The skin was smooth and shiny. It was tasty, juicy, with flavor all its own. And it wasn't quite round. It came to 5 knobs on one end. Jesse Hyatt really liked this apple. He named it Hawkeye for Iowa, the Hawkeye State. But he wanted to see the variety grown commercially, so he sent some to a fruit show in Kansas City. The purpose of this show was to discover new varieties of all fruits, but he was disappointed when nobody contacted him about these apples. But what he didn't know was the white of egg that he used to fasten his name on with didn't hold. Nobody knew where the apples came from. The next year he sent some more, and he went along himself. And a nursery man named Stark was there waiting for him, hoping that the apples that had caught his fancy the year before would be there again. And he bought that tree from Jesse Hyatt, and he built a fence around it, and he gave it a new name, Delicious, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It's one of the leading apples in the world. And he began to make cuttings from it, and he was soon selling trees far and wide. Then in an orchard of these Delicious near Mullica Hill, New Jersey, there was one tree, the same as all the other trees except for one thing. On one limb of that tree, the apples were redder. All of the apples were redder. Every year they were redder. This was found to be a sport, a mutation. It's kind of a freak of nature that happens once in a while when a tree, or sometimes a single limb, as this was, develops a new characteristic. Often it's worse, but sometimes it's better. And it's kind of a rule of nature that all of the trees that are propagated from this tree or this single limb will have the new characteristic. They are clones. The same nursery from Missouri, Stark Brothers, heard about this tree and came to see it. They liked it and bought it. They paid $6,000 for that one tree, and they built a cage around the whole tree and placed an armed guard beside it. They named it Starking Delicious and began to take cuttings from it, and were soon selling trees far and wide. Since then, very few of the old Delicious trees have been planted. None are being planted today. This has happened many times in all varieties. Many of the varieties today that have the old-fashioned names like Delicious or Stamen Winesap or Own Beauty are sports or strains from the original variety. But the search for new varieties will never cease. And if $6,000 seems like a lot to pay for one tree, in 1958 Stark Brothers paid $25,000 for another strain of Red Delicious. And in 1963 they bought a Golden Delicious for $51,000. We make our livings growing, packing, shipping, and selling apples. And I have a movie here, most of the things we do with the apples until they leave the farm. Though this film was taken in our own orchard, the same machinery, the same operations are used in orchards all over the country. Now this was taken up to about 1980, and there are newer techniques being used now in 2005. So this film is history. But let's take a look at how apples are produced. When warm weather comes to the apple bud in the spring, a new growing season begins. This is the story of that season. Our finished product was a bag of apples. Work on these apples started in the orchard more than a year earlier with the pruning of the trees. We did most of our pruning from a platform mounted on top of a tractor. The men walked out on kickboards to put them right in the tree. We used powered pruners, powered by an air compressor on the back of the tractor. Just squeeze the handle and the clipper works. Just squeeze the handle and the lint comes off. We would begin to prune in November and prune every day we can stand the weather into June, sometimes even July. We also used a cherry picker that got the man right up there where the cutting was. Occasionally we would rent a tree topper just to take the tops out of the trees. There were 7 circular saws, each one capable of cutting a limb the size of a fireplace log, just zip. This just gives them a crew cut we had to go through later and thin them out. The same machine can be adapted to hedge, cut from the sides of the trees. For a while I thought this would be the last picture I'd ever take. When we're through, the ground's covered with brush we had to get out of our way by either raking it out into the middles or we would use an air blast sprayer to blow it out. Then the brush shredder came along. This machine straddles a big pile of brush, makes an awful slam-banging noise, and leaves practically nothing behind. It's ground up between rows of spinning steel teeth and left in little pieces on the ground where it decomposes and forms organic matter, which becomes plant food. Some of our plant food came in the fertilizer bag. We will take soil samples every year and have them analyzed, and we would apply the nutrients and the amount of the nutrients that these soil tests indicate that we needed. In later years, most of our blocks received no fertilizer at all. Similar equipment is used for spreading lime, which is also applied according to soil analysis. Lime sweetens the soil, adds calcium and magnesium. No matter how productive an orchard may have been in the past, no matter how many good crops of fine apples it's produced, the time will come when it has to be removed. My father planted this orchard before I was born, and it grew many good apples. But the trees were getting old, the variety was no longer desirable, so it had to come out. We constantly took out old trees, planted new. Then the land is prepared and a new orchard is planted. All fruit trees are propagated. They take a twig or a bud from the variety desired and graft it or bud at the rootstock. If you took a seed and planted it, you'd get an apple tree, but the chances of the fruit being anything desirable are very slight. The trees that Johnny Appleseed planted from seed beautified the countryside, but I'm afraid the fruit from many of them was disappointing. Here are 3 generations of us Roberts just planting one of the trees in this new orchard, my father, my son, and myself. And the same orchard a few years later, where it's beginning to bear fruit. Now let's leave our orchards for a moment and visit the site of that first delicious tree in Iowa. From this cave came the seed that produced the apple that became the backbone of an industry. In a sudden freeze in 1940, the tree was killed to the ground, but the roots survived and put up shoots. When we were there were 2 trees growing on the original root, still within the fence erected by Stark in the 1890s, still bearing apples identical to those that Jesse Hyatt fastened his name to with a white of egg. Back home again, as soon as the buds break in the spring, as soon as the first green begins to show, they have to be protected against diseases and insects. We would use a dozen or more different materials. We would spray a dozen or more different times. We used an integrated pest management program, selecting pesticides that would be least apt to damage the predators that keep other insects under control. I was often asked if we killed birds with our spraying. Here's a bird's nest in a tree just before harvest. We would hire a scout to come in every week to look to see what is actually in the orchard, diseases and insects. Leaf insects, the leaves would be brushed onto a slide and examined under a microscope. And the insects and diseases actually found in the orchard and knowing the life cycle would determine the materials used and the timing of the spray. Young trees, even if they're not yet bearing fruit, had to be protected against diseases and insects. The most important time in the life of an apple tree is the blooming period. Every blossom, every flower that becomes an apple must be pollinated by honeybees. And in most cases it must be pollen from another variety of apples, even if that variety is a quarter of a mile away. To ensure pollination, we would rent hives of bees from a beekeeper. We pay to have them brought into the orchard. They don't pay us for the honey. More work is accomplished per pound by bees than anything I can imagine, because there are 5,000 bees to the pound, and they really work. Even if a field bee should live to a normal old age, she won't live long enough to enjoy the honey that she's helped produce. But it's a fact of life. They have a job to do, and they do it. There are many crops that wouldn't survive were it not for the honeybee. They're one of the marvels of nature. They bring the nectar back to the hive on their hind legs. You'll see the globs of yellow there. How they find their way back is a mystery to me, but they make many trips back and forth every day. The hive is air-conditioned, but they have to cool it themselves, and it's this one's job to fan the entrance. There'll be many more inside the hive doing the same thing. The blooming period is also the time when the apples are most easily damaged or killed by frost. We would have some frost every few years. Sometimes it seemed pretty frequently. Occasionally we would try to prevent damage by burning old tires early in the morning. This particular time we didn't have any damage where we burned old tires that morning. In fact, we didn't have any damage where we didn't burn them either, so we could have stayed in bed. But we were never sorry when we worked a good part of the night, even if it was for nothing, because we knew we were doing what we could when we thought we were in trouble. Of course, this is causing air pollution and is no longer permitted to burn tires. Another method of frost control is irrigation. If we can build up a coating of ice, if the frost, the freeze isn't too severe, damage can be prevented. But once we wet the trees, we're committed to it. We have to keep putting water on until the ice is completely melted the next day. This is on peaches. Many other crops, strawberries, cranberries, blueberries, are protected with irrigation. One fellow found me in the yard that morning. He said, "You know, all the trees are covered with ice down there." Well, I guess I do. I was up all night getting it on there. This particular time, it turned windy, and we should not have irrigated then. It built up a tremendous coating of ice. And we had to keep putting water on to melt the ice until nearly 7 o'clock the following evening. I almost vowed we wouldn't do it again. But then we did it again the next morning. There's some tree breakage, but in a couple of years they've grown out of it. And I can tell you, the first time you do this and you see that blossom completely encased in ice, you're wondering if you're doing the right thing. We kept some of our equipment for a long time. Then all too soon, the blooming period is over. We like to keep the ground bare under young trees especially, so all the moisture and all the nutrients will go to the tree. This is a tree tiller that reaches out under the limbs and stirs the ground beneath. Much of this is now done chemically with herbicide. We use a rotary mower, like a big lawnmower, to cut the growth between the rows. And the hay-type mowing machine that reaches under and cuts the growth beneath the trees. Several varieties of apples, Golden Delicious especially, have a tendency to bear biennially, a tremendous crop one year but practically no apples the next. We can overcome this by thinning the year they're heavy. Most of this is done chemically, but some is done by hand. At first, Jose here thought this was a mistake. He didn't want to do it. He'd rather just look at the job. But since we were paying him anyhow, I guess he thought he should look like he's working. We finally convinced him it was the thing to do. We told him he should never look at the ground. But after a while he did look at the ground, and this is what he saw. This may seem wasteful, but we can grow more better apples this way. Today, apples, all fruit, is being planted much closer together. In an earlier day, they had wide spacing, So when the trees were young, other crops could be planted in between. These were cane house tomatoes, also being protected against diseases and insects. We had a green cooking apple, star apple, that picked during the summer. This isn't one of our regular pickers. We were fortunate to have plenty of water on the farm. This is the south branch of the Rancocas Creek that comes down through Vincenttown. Apple trees have a very extensive root system and can stand a lot of dry weather. But a full-size apple tree can use a barrel of water every day. So in extremely dry seasons, irrigation can be helpful. We're using giant sprinklers here. These are very commonly used now. They throw a stream of water nearly 200 feet, cover about an acre at a time. One of them in the middle of a football field would cover the whole field. An occurrence dreaded by all farmers, fruit growers especially, is hail. We would catch a hailstorm, seemed every few years. This was a particularly bad one. We figured 20 million hailstones hit apples in our orchard that afternoon. And in just a few minutes, apples that would have been worth $10 a bushel at that time were reduced to something worth less than $1. When the sun came out, before the ice had melted, our marketing co-op was on the phone finding homes for these apples. There were several growers involved. Before the ice had melted already, they were showing the bumps, the nicks, the bruises, the cuts they would always bear. All summer long, the apples have been growing a little bit larger every day. Then late in the summer, early fall, they begin to develop red color. All red color comes from cool evenings and from light. It comes from the sun. If you tied a bag around an apple so it wouldn't get any light, it wouldn't develop any red color. Then as the harvest season approaches, we begin to get ready for it. Here we're taking the empty bins out to the orchard, the containers that the apples will be picked in and will be stored in until they're sold. These hold about 17 bushels of apples. And most fruit and vegetable crops are now handled in bins this way. Then a few days before harvest, the final spray is put on. This is not a poisonous spray. It helps hold the apples on the tree. If there's a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, I've never found it. Then the pickers are taken to the orchard so early in the morning we can hardly see them. And the harvest begins. Most varieties are picked at least twice. We'll go through the first time picking the apples that are red, the one with enough color, the one that have gotten the light around the outside and the top of the tree. We use picking buckets. They're strapped right on. The bottom of the bucket opens up so the apples can be gently transferred to the bin. We thought we'd better give this fellow some more instruction. You might have seen that apple fall. Any apple that drops stays on the ground until the tree's entirely picked, and then it's handled separately. These pickers are Puerto Ricans that we house right on the farm. Most of them spoke no English, but they're good pickers, but it becomes more difficult every season to get enough Puerto Ricans, or anybody for that matter, to pick apples. We get anybody we can, and we often have quite an assortment. My wife called that the long and the short of it. This man wore a mask. We didn't know who he was. These were too small. We had to send them back. When the bins are full, they hold over 750 pounds of apple. Now, up until now, the picking and everything has been done the same way my great-grandfather did it in the 1800s. But after they're in the bins, then we can use modern labor-saving technology. There go about 80 bushels just like that. There comes a time every harvest season, every October, when most of the apples are picked. When it seems all the apples are ready to pick at once, we can't get them off fast enough. It becomes a race against time, and everybody has to hurry. Oh, if they only could. Then they'll go into storage. We stored most of our apples in storages right on the farm, as do most growers. A lot of work is being done all over the country to develop mechanical harvest of all fruits and vegetables. Here is a machine being used at Larchmont Farms when they were in Masonville to pick apples up off the ground, which it did. In fact, it picked up anything that was there, sticks, stones, bottles, everything. But like these early machines, the fruit was handled roughly, was bruised, and had to go to processors right away. We're hoping the time will come when we have a machine that will gently pick apples for the fresh market. And this is where they're unloaded at the packing house and cold storage. The machine is called an applejack, but seldom stops when unloading. Before going into storage, most apples are dipped in a kind of preservative to prevent apple scald, which is a very harmful disorder, not a disease, that would affect the firmness and soundness of the fruit and make it unsaleable on the fresh market. Some apples are still handled in smaller boxes, as you see here, but they naturally require more handling, more labor. This method of dipping was our own invention. The Baptists are interested in it. Then they would go right into storage while they were still wet. Once in a while, I like to get on one of these forklift trucks too to help the fellas out and display my skill. Yeah, I was younger then. Then during the winter and spring, as the apples are sold, they're brought out of storage and run through the packing house. This is a controlled atmosphere storage room. We would fill it up, seal the door closed, turn on machinery that reduced the oxygen in the air. We would keep it about 3%. It had to be less than 5% for at least 90 days to be able to be sold as controlled atmosphere, CA apples. Then the bins are stood on end hydraulically and the apples roll out on a belt. First they go through the washer where they're thoroughly washed. This isn't to remove spray residue. We're very careful to leave the proper interval between the last application and harvest. This is to wash off all the dirt and the dust they've accumulated in the many weeks they've been hanging on the tree. Then they go on to the roller grater where the apples rotate so the girls can see every side of them. And they'll take out the seconds, the apples with defects or not enough color. Then they go on to the sizing machine. If an apple is large enough to be touched by that black spinning spool in the center, it'll be ejected into the bin. Big apples come off first. We could make 12 different sizes on our machine with just 1/8 of an inch difference between sizes. But many apples were packed, the smaller ones, many sizes together, in bags. Every girl has her own scale. She'd fasten the bag on, open the gate, roll in the apples. When the weight's about right, the gate will pop up. She'd check the scale. She may have to add an apple or take one out. Then a little label goes in identifying it. Now that you see just how this is done, I have to tell you we don't do it this way anymore. They roll into a scoop and are weighed in the scoop and slid into the bag, and this is much quicker. Then the bags are sealed with a piece of tape and go into the master carton for shipping. Some sales require that every apple be individually wrapped in a piece of paper. This isn't being done much now. This is a tray carton. It's like an egg case. There is a tray for every layer and a cup for every apple. They can even be shipped overseas in this container. We put some apples into our own cider. They've already been washed and sorted, then are dumped into the bin and go up the elevator into the grinder. And this is how cider is made. They take a nylon cloth and spread a layer of ground up apples on them. When they come out of the grinder, they're very fine, like applesauce. Then the corners of the cloth are folded over and a wooden rack is put on, and another cloth. Cider was made basically this same way for centuries. It's only been relatively recently that there's been a better method. There's now a continuous process. This is a batch process. Then they're rolled under the press and the hydraulic pump is turned on and they get a 35-ton squeeze and the cider really pours. When cider first comes off the press, it's kind of a whitish yellow, the same as an apple is when you cut it. But the same as a cut apple will turn brown in a few minutes, so will cider. Then it goes through a strainer and is pumped upstairs into stainless steel refrigerated tanks. Then 2 men spend 2 hours washing up afterwards. Some apples are moved in bulk in vans to canners. Some are shipped to other cider mills, dumped loose in a big trailer. This trailer will hold enough apples to make 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of cider. Some apples are moved right in the bins they were picked in. We sold some in our own retail sales room. This girl wasn't there all the time. In fact, there was seldom anybody there. People selected what they wanted already bagged up. And it was honor system. They dropped their money down a slot. We hoped they did. Cider was available in there too, but they had to put the money in the slot first. Then the jug came out through the barrel. But most apples went out by truck to chain store warehouses, many other outlets. Many were exported, sold by Jersey Fruit Co-op, who handled most of the better New Jersey apple. We packed under a label with Johnny Appleseed on it for Jersey Fruit. With all the machinery, all the operations, all the people, you might forget nature's part in all of this and that apples grow on trees. But it takes the winter as well as the spring, and the sun and the rain to produce a perfect apple that nearly everyone enjoys eating anytime. And with modern storing techniques, nearly every week in the year, you can get an apple that tastes as if it just came off the tree.